Hello and welcome. Today, we're diving into a really beautiful and honestly, an essential practice for anyone who engages with the Qur'an. We're talking about the prostration of recitation, or as it's known, Sujud al-Tilawah. So, have you ever been reading the Qur'an, maybe turning a page, and you spot this little symbol, kind of like a mosque arch, right next to a verse? You probably thought, I know this means something. Well, you're right. It's basically a signal, an invitation, and we're going to break down exactly what it means and what you need to do.
Okay, first things first, let's build our foundation here. We're going to cover what this prostration is, why we do it, and maybe most importantly, who is actually required to do it.
At its heart, Sujud al-Tilawah is a single, powerful act of submission. It's pretty straightforward. When you either read or hear one of these very specific verses in the Qur'an, you're meant to perform one sajda. It's a way of immediately acknowledging God's greatness and showing humility, right there, in that moment, in response to his words.
So, you might be wondering, is this just a nice thing to do? A recommendation? Nope. The ruling on this is that it's wajib, which means obligatory. And why? Because the verses themselves contain a direct command to prostrate. And in Islamic jurisprudence, a command implies an obligation. So the big takeaway here is that this isn't something to just brush off.
So who exactly does this fall on? It's pretty simple. It applies to two main groups. First, the reciter. That's the person actually speaking the verse out loud. And second, the listener. And the key word here is intentionally, the person who is purposefully listening to that recitation. Both of you share in this act of worship.
And this is where it gets really interesting, just how wide-ranging this obligation is. It applies to pretty much everyone who recites or hears the verse. That includes someone in a state of major impurity, a woman on her period, even a non-Muslim who happens to hear it, a child, or someone who doesn't have wudu. The call to prostrate really is universal.
Okay, but there's one very, very important exception to keep in mind. While the obligation technically includes women who are menstruating or have postpartum bleeding, if they can't perform it at that moment, they are not required to make it up later. And the reason for this is because the prostration is considered a part of prayer, which they are exempt from during that time.
All right, so we know what it is, we know who it's for, but where in the world do you find these verses in the Quran? Let's take a quick tour of the 14 locations.
So there are 14 specific spots scattered throughout the Quran. You'll find them in surahs like Al-A'raf and An-Nahl early on, all the way to the very end of the Quran in surahs An-Najm, Al-Inshiqaq, and the final one in surah Al-Alaq. Now, don't worry about memorizing this list. The good news is that pretty much every copy of the Quran will have that little symbol we talked about, so you'll know it when you see it.
Now for the practical part. How do you actually do it? This is the best part, because it is incredibly simple and straightforward. No complications here.
It's just 3 quick moves. First, you make the intention in your heart. Then you say Allahu Akbar as you go down into prostration. But here's a key detail. You don't raise your hands like you do to start a prayer. Second, you just perform one single sajda. And third, you say Allahu Akbar again as you come back up.
And that's literally it. Done. Notice what's missing. There's no sitting for tashahhud, and there's no taslim, no saying assalamu alaikum at the end. It's just a direct, focused act of submission, and then you just carry on with what you were doing.
Okay, now things get just a little more detailed when this happens inside of our formal prayer, our salat. So let's look at the special rulings for how to handle this prostration when you're already in the middle of praying.
So the rules here all depend on who's doing the reciting. If the imam recites the verse, well, he has to prostrate, and everyone behind him must follow him down. Simple. But what if you, as a follower, are reciting it quietly to yourself? In that case, nobody prostrates. Not you, not the imam. This keeps the prayer flowing in order. And finally, if you're praying and you hear the verse from an outsider, like from a radio or a TV in another room, you don't do anything during the prayer. You just finish your prayer and then perform the prostration afterwards.
Just a couple of final, really crucial points about doing this in prayer. It's considered disliked or makruh for an imam to recite a sajda verse during a silent prayer like Dhuhr or Asr. Why? Because it can totally confuse the people behind him who can't hear what's going on. Also, and this is a big one, if you're in prayer and you miss the sajda for whatever reason, it's just dropped. You can't make it up later. You just move on.
Okay, let's wrap this up by tackling some of the most common questions people have. A little rapid-fire Q&A to make sure everything is crystal clear. This is a fantastic question, especially for students of the Qur'an or anyone who's memorizing. Let's say you're working on a verse and you repeat it 10, 20, maybe even 50 times in one go.
Do you have to prostrate 50 times?
The answer, thankfully, is no. One single prostration is all you need for that whole session for that specific verse. This ruling is there to prevent things from getting too difficult, which keeps the practice easy and accessible for everyone.
Now, what about the opposite scenario? We just said if you miss it in prayer, it's dropped. But what if you were just reading at home, you heard the verse, and you just forgot or you couldn't do it right away? What then?
Well, in this case, because it's an obligation, it stays an obligation. You should make it up as soon as you can. It doesn't just vanish. You simply perform that one single prostration whenever you remember.
You know, this brings us to a really beautiful piece of etiquette, which is summed up perfectly in this principle. The reciter is like the imam for the listener. What does that mean? It means if you're listening to someone recite, you shouldn't pop up from your prostration before they do. You follow their lead just like you would with an imam in prayer. It's about unity and worship.
So, we've covered the what, the where, the how, and the when. But that leaves us with the biggest question of all, the why. Beyond all the rules, what's the real spirit of this act? In that brief, fleeting moment of putting our forehead to the ground, what are we truly saying about the power of these divine words and about our own place in this vast universe? Now that is something to reflect on the next time you hear that call to prostrate.